to be fully lucid when introducing someone. It's often the hardest part of these things.
Yeah, just to get rolling, puff of smoke at the beginning of the thing.
If only. We actually do run those sessions, but not today. Benjamin Studebaker, it's an honor to welcome you. You're a political theorist. You're the author of Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies and the Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. I came across your work, first of all, through conversation with Cadell Last, Philosophy Portal, and Daniel Garner of OG Rose, both of whom have been on the podcast many times, and actually also in the last few episodes as well. And I get the sense that our conversation today will be following on with many of those threads raised. Just to give you a bit of context there, one of the core parts of conversation between Cadell and I was on the theopolitical, and Daniel's work, of course, in relation, we titled that podcast, The Trance of Ideology. Now, politics. I'm curious how you define that. What is politics? What is the domain of the political?
It's a great question, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So for me, the political is to do with intractable disagreement. So in your ordinary life, you may have disagreements with people, but ordinarily you can work through them with communication and come to some sort of consensus. Maybe it's not a perfect consensus. Maybe you make a deal with somebody. You agree to do something in exchange for them agreeing to do something. Maybe you go along with something they're doing for a while, thinking that they'll go along with something you want to do for a while at some other point. But when you have an intractable disagreement, you have a disagreement that if you talk about it, it doesn't go away. And sometimes talking about it makes it worse, or draws further attention to it, or causes the disagreement to become more painful. So when you have intractable disagreement, to be able to act and to move forward, despite the fact that you have that disagreement, requires some sort of second order appeal. So it requires a decision that's made even though there is no consensus, no agreement existing. That decision will therefore be resentment generating, because somebody's going to not get what they want. Somebody's going to feel coerced or subject to a process that they can't fully identify with. A feeling of alienation will be created. So political decisions have to be legitimated. It has to be explained why it was necessary to take this decision in a way that transgressed against the absence of consensus and the absence of persuasion having taken effect. And for me, legitimacy is this domain of explaining actions and decisions that are taken in this situation. The difficult thing is that because these decisions involve alienation and resentment, it's quite difficult to make people fully satisfied with them. So in legitimacy, there's often a kind of aim of getting people to fully endorse what takes place. But very rarely does that happen, because the fact that you've had to resort to a decision without a consensus existing means that very likely people are going to object to the decision. And then in many cases, they're going to object to the process by which the decision was taken. But the standard technique in a political arrangement is to defend a controversial decision on the grounds that it comes from a process that is fair, or knowledge based on knowledge. The people who took the decision abided by some rules or some procedure that ensures the decision is based on knowledge, or it's fair with regard to input. And often, both of these things at once. And if you're able to persuade people that the process is good, then even though they might not like the specific decision in the individual instance, they may nonetheless go along with it. They may accept the decision, even if they don't endorse it, or they may tolerate it with some reluctance. The big difficulty in politics is when you can't legitimate decisions. And then you get into this question of, is there going to be a rebellion, a revolt, an attempt to change the regime or to overthrow it? But in my work, I focus on cases where people, for various reasons, don't believe they can accomplish anything through revolution or revolt. So even if they don't like the decisions, and even if they don't accept the legitimation stories that are told to persuade them to accept the process, they nonetheless are not able to respond with revolution, revolt, regime change. At the same time, they're not convinced of the legitimation stories. So they don't believe that the actions are acceptable. They don't think that the procedures are fair or grounded in knowledge or work particularly well. So they're in this kind of lacuna, what I call minimal legitimacy. They are tolerating the regime because they don't think they can replace it with anything. So they still have a minimal level of endorsement, but this endorsement doesn't come from any positive commitment to the regime or its procedures, but just from a lack of confidence in there being an alternative that they could positively and constructively champion.
What do we need, or what need to be the conditions for us to come to trust, expending our energy to realizing an alternative, to choosing a meaningfully new political option? Maybe you want to explore that either in terms of reformation or revolution, or if you want to take those frames off the table to some important degree and situate us back in a place of, well, how to even approach political change in a context in which, as you have argued, the way is shut in terms of the business as usual ways we might think that process happens. What do those conditions need to be? For instance, I can imagine trust being critical to that.
So there's a level of trust that you could draw upon in ordinary social circumstances where you're having a disagreement in your family or with your friends. That kind of trust tends to be harder to come by in political situations, because in the political situation, someone has resorted to making a decision in the absence of consensus. So someone has acted in a way which potentially will seem as a betrayal because they haven't brought you along all the way. They haven't fully persuaded you of the act before they've taken it. So there's a trust problem in politics right from the get-go. To get around this trust problem, you've got to have some sort of account of why the process is the best possible process available, despite the fact that the process has produced decisions that the people in question don't agree with. So you move the level of argument up a level into this procedural territory and away from the specific policy issues. The difficult thing is if the procedures have seemed to, over time, become unfair, or if they don't seem to get results, if they don't seem to deliver on the specific, what I call legitimating abstractions that are important to people. So these would be abstract values at the center of people's worldviews, things like God, nature, freedom, equality, representation, peace, prosperity, order. If the procedures don't seem to produce decisions that connect with these abstractions, then this tends to erode confidence in them. The trouble is if you've got a complicated world system in which it's become very easy for money to move around the world in response to incentives, so a high level of capital mobility, it becomes really difficult for governments to make policy in ways that seem efficacious with respect to a number of these different abstractions. So it seems difficult for governments to generate shared prosperity. It seems difficult for governments to give people freedom to be able to live the kinds of lives that they want to live, make the kinds of family structures, church structures, social structures they'd like to see. So as the government loses the capacity to take decisions that seem to accord with the legitimating abstractions that people affirm, there's then a question of, well, is the procedure fair? And is the procedure really based on knowledge? Oftentimes, those will be the core kinds of procedural claims that will be made. And then sometimes people retreat to very minimalist procedural arguments. They'll say, well, you don't have to trust that the government makes decisions in a fair way or has any kind of special knowledge about policy, because at least in democracy, you have the option to vote the government out. So here you start to have a procedural argument that's grounded on the idea that you never trust the government. It's just a group of elites that you will have the power to throw out through the election. And in any other kind of regime, you would have a group of elites that you couldn't throw out through the election. And this is the minimal advantage that you have in democracy, the capacity to throw out the people you don't trust, as opposed to being stuck with the people you don't trust. And because there hasn't been any kind of positive case for something other than democracy that's really motivating, this very minimal kind of argument has managed to stick around and do a lot of work for democracy over the years. Particularly because I think we're living in a historical period where there's this shadow cast by the 20th century, by Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, these authoritarian regimes that were created in the name of freedom or equality or a shared prosperity, but which didn't seem to deliver on the things that they were created for, and which caused enormous amounts of suffering, in some cases world war, along the way. So there is, I think, a lack of confidence on the part of people that they, even if they had some other regime in mind, that they could make it, and that if they tried to make it, it would actually deliver on what they're looking for. You look at somebody like Vladimir Lenin. Lenin wanted a regime which did one set of things. He got a regime that ultimately looked quite different from the regime he wanted. So people think, even if I know what I want, I won't be able to actually realize it. And in trying to realize it, I'll get something else, something very bad. And that's if I survive even to make the thing. There's also a great likelihood that I'll be killed along the way. So there's, I think, a lot of fear that comes from that legacy of the 20th century that sits over our politics and causes that old Churchill quote to be very resonant. Democracy, the worst form of government, except all others that have been tried. And who are you, to think that you can come up with something better?
How would you characterize more of this fear that people feel, perhaps also apathy they might feel in relation to participating politically? And also, where is power today? What constitutes power today on the global stage from your perspective?
Ooh, great question. So I think if you don't believe that you can make a different regime, but you recognize that this regime is not going to be able to deliver for you, a relatively reasonable response is to say, well, why should I follow politics or be heavily involved in it? Because the regime that exists is not going to be able to deliver for me. It will take whatever energy I throw into it and burn it up. And if I try to make something else, I'm liable to be killed, I'm liable to waste my life, or even insofar as I succeed, it's likely to backfire or go very badly. I think a lot of people, therefore, reasonably don't pay very close attention to politics and try to avoid it. In my work, I call this the enclavist position, the position of trying to hide from politics in one of what I call the 4 Fs: faith, family, fandoms, and futurism, each of which I respect and regard as a valuable side of human endeavor. But in relation to the political, they can become places to hide. And they have only limited functionality for this purpose because, of course, all of these different things still exist in our society. They're affected by how our political system works, how our economy works, how our social system works. And so the enclaves are always being pressed by the thing that they are an attempt to avoid or escape from. The second part of that question Remind me again? Anytime I get a two-part question, I always forget the second part.
Well, it's to do with power.
Power.
So
Who has power?
apathy and fear in relationship broadly to the political, but then who has power that is importantly would be mediating that sense of apathy, I'm just not powerful enough, not just to who, but also structurally. And then, well, fear, there are consequences for seeking to do creative things in this life and sharing what one really cares about, because then people know what you really care about, and that's vulnerable.
Yeah. So I think even elites in this system rarely experience themselves as very powerful and often feel like underdogs, because this is a system where there are these huge structural incentives that have been created by the enormous expansion of global trade and capital mobility. So if you act in a way that reduces the profitability of firms, if you tax firms heavily, if you try to create very strong labor protections, you try to raise wages, if you try to regulate heavily how industry can operate in a given territory, this makes that territory less attractive to the money, which then will tend to flow somewhere else. And not because a group of people get together and decide to punish the particular state in question, although some people will say things like that in media, but simply because there's a higher return on investment if you direct it somewhere else. And there's very limited impediment. So if you go back to the 20th century, where we had a lower level of economic inequality, during that period, there were all of these impediments to moving money and wealth around. Factories were much more difficult to move from place to place. There were, of course, all of these tariffs that were constructed in the middle of the 20th century that were only very gradually wound down over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And then also there were these gigantic world wars, these incredible cataclysms that made it actually dangerous to move from place to place physically. And governments, on the basis of those wars and the security crisis that they created, were able to levy enormously high rates of tax. So during that period, people who had money had much less leverage. But as soon as World War II ended, a process began of reopening global trade. And gradually, we had the series of GATT trade rounds, the creation of the World Trade Organization in the mid-'80s, and we had the abolition of capital controls. So governments no longer can prevent money from leaving the country rapidly. They're no longer allowed to erect barriers and trap money. It used to be the case that a government could freeze its financial system in the event that lots of people were trying to leave at the same time to stabilize it. That's no longer possible. These changes have greatly diminished the capacity of nation states to make independent policy. And this extends even to the states that have the most relative power in the system, the very big states that do an enormous amount of production or consumption, like the United States or China. Even these states find that their ability to make new rules unilaterally is very limited. And then there are all of these problems with coordination. If states try to act together to make new rules, they tend to find that different governments in different parts of the world understand the problem differently, want to do different things to control it. And then because of the electoral rules in all of these different countries, very rarely do you get governments elected in all of these countries at the same time that understand the problem in roughly the same way, such that they could come together and make new rules and solve it in any particular way in a reasonable time frame. So democracy has a kind of political time that works on a cycle, an electoral cycle, that's indexed to the amount of time in between elections. And in most democracies, it's 4 years or 5 years. In the case of the United States House of Representatives, it's 2. So you have these very short windows where you have governments that can reasonably rely on each other to think about the problem together. And the problems have become complicated enough, they've become sophisticated enough that the amount of time even to negotiate a good bilateral trade deal between two states, let alone a multilateral framework, it's now many, many years to accomplish these things. It usually takes multiple presidential administrations in a row committed to roughly the same policy to be able to get it through. And it's become harder and harder to have that credibility and continuity across administrations in the United States. And therefore, for countries all over the world, it's hard to make deals with the United States because you don't know what's going to happen on the electoral timeline in the United States. So all of this has created a situation where it feels almost as if no one is in charge, but in another sense, it seems as if money in some abstract sense is in charge.
Yeah. So money, the modulation of attention through tech platforms, algorithms, and that way of treating the world in general. I'm particularly interested in how we treat communication as such, how we treat each other, whether as consumers or objects to influence to purchase this or that, or whether we support the conditions for the cultivation of real relationships and mutual support. So over the course of some time now in the podcast and in my own writing, it feels very important to bring in the lens of technofeudalism, which as a term has been popularized by Yanis Varoufakis, but is also used by others here and there. I'm curious how you think about technofeudalism as a concept, whether or not you see us already having moved into, as Varoufakis does, a situation in which most of the world order is characterized by the new feudal lords of the tech oligarchs who have these platforms from X through Amazon, Apple through Alibaba, which with their access to data, capacity to model aggregate decision making, and also to influence aggregate decision making, and of course also have tremendous influence over governments in terms of where they might place their factories and maybe the conditions of workers and different things as well, as another way to look at the power there over the system. But the part I'd like to just bring in, as well as to sort of get your thoughts in general, is what the conditioning of that way of relating with the communicational commons, or the modulating the signals that we receive as we reach out and meet the world through apps, as we seek to satisfy various preferences, meet partners, develop relationships, pitch ourselves for jobs, brand ourselves so as to compete for attention increasingly in so many different domains of life. There's something very important about the way we bring ourselves to what reaches and touches and influences others. So techno-feudalism, and then how you think about that politically, and then the more insidious ways that communication functions and our modulation of communication functions as a mediator of power politically.
Yeah, techno-feudalism. So I think on the one hand, techno-feudalism gestures at a desire to understand what's new and different about now. On the other hand, because it's got the word feudalism in it, it seems to suggest a historical analogy. So it tends to prompt a lot of resistance on the grounds that now looks different from the Middle Ages in various ways. And there's a kind of stylized Marxist way of distinguishing feudalism and the Middle Ages from capitalism and modernity that tends to become an obstacle in discussing some of the discrete changes that people who use the term techno-feudalism are trying to get us to discuss. So I think one of the basic changes would be something Thomas Piketty referred to in the early 10s, which is we had a period where the growth rate in most countries was higher than the rate of return to capital. So even though particular rich people would have a rate of return on their investment, if the economy was growing with sufficient speed, their wealth still became smaller relative to the size of the economy over time, even if they were doing quite well financially. The period in which that was true, the kind of mid-century period between World War I and maybe the end of the 70s. In certain countries, you might find it a little bit different, maybe in the 20s or 30s as a beginning. In some places, the 80s or 90s as an end. But that kind of period of mid-century leveling, that's come to an end. Another thing that is very different is the change in the media form that occurred first with the introduction of television, which greatly flattened out and made uniform the culture so that we could have something like mass culture or popular culture. And then the coming apart of that with the internet, and then the attempt to put that back together that we're now seeing, and that we have been seeing for the last 10 years or so. So one of the things that really stood out to me, especially because I was someone who blogged in the early 10s, is the changes to the algorithms on search engines, and then, of course, on YouTube, to push down political content, and particularly political content that came from independent or anti-establishment sources, and to instead promote stuff that was more cultural in its emphasis, less overtly political, and often stuff that promoted outrage or anger or upset that generated some kind of negative affect and was divisive, in the case of Twitter or X. And then in the case of Facebook or Threads, an attempt to make everything warm and fuzzy and very friendly and to not have anything too acrimonious. So differences in the style with which how this was done, some edgy, aggressive, others softer, warmer, fuzzier. But in all of these cases, a pushing down of anything seriously political in favor of talk about lifestyle, talk about celebrities. That happened just about everywhere on the internet. And it happened in part because the heads of these tech companies were called into Congress and made to testify before Congress about the role that their media companies had played in disseminating potentially Russian propaganda, influencing the result of the election. Do they have monopoly power over the discourse, which they're using to subvert public opinion? And in Europe, an enormous amount of literature was published on the role of the Anglophone tech companies in disrupting public discourse and deliberation. So in response to this, to try to avoid being regulated or potentially trust busted by the United States or the European Union, these tech companies closed up what could be distributed effectively on the internet. They didn't necessarily close up what could be said, though of course there were cases in which people were simply banned or shadow banned, but they made it much more difficult to distribute. And particularly, you can't stick an external link anymore on Twitter or Facebook and have that get picked up by the algorithm and distributed. Today, people who are trying to do that have to post a photo, and then they have to stick the link in a sneaky way underneath it and hope that people look at the comments and find the link. It's become much, much harder. And the numbers for all sorts of content have become enormously poor, to the point where if you try to distribute a Substack link on Twitter, you have to bleep the word Substack as if it's a dirty word. All of this is a complete change from the way the internet was operating as late as 2015, 2016, maybe even into 2017, 18. So this has caused the internet to become more like television. And in becoming more like television, there is a sense in which, on the one hand, it's becoming more like the mid-century period because we have a more curated public discourse that's more heavily shaped by a handful of large media companies. But at the same time, we have an increase in the level of economic inequality and political inequality, as opposed to a decrease. So in the 50s and 60s, you had this mass culture with shrinking inequality. So you seem to be invited to participate in this mass culture, which is an uplifting and an attempt to bring ordinary people into high culture, or to make high culture something that ordinary people can access. Now we have something else going on. Now we have a mass culture being created by a small number of companies on the internet, and the function of this mass culture is to disrupt the conversation that was going on before, make it increasingly difficult for that conversation to be had, and to get people arguing with each other and angry with each other. And this exacerbating disagreement is a strategy that was not the goal of policy typically in the Cold War era, in the middle of the 20th century. There, the assumption was that you had to unite society. So the function of the big networks was to get society united behind the government in this ideological struggle with the other system and the other regime. Now there is no real genuine fear of an alternative system or an alternative regime. So people feeling disaffected or feeling angry doesn't have the consequences it was historically thought to have. So instead of being concerned that if you make everybody angry and upset, they might engage in revolutionary behavior, they might revolt, they might cause trouble, now the most they can do is engage in criminal activity, which would give you an excuse to arrest them. But in most cases, they will simply become less sociable, less cooperative. They'll have a harder time going into any kind of social organization and being functional. And so what this does is it increases the instances in our day-to-day lives where we encounter intractable disagreement. We're finding that we're having it with family members, with friends, in social clubs, in places where we used to be able to socially cooperate and come to consensus. Now, there's all of this very, very intense anger and fighting over things that often have very little to do with people's day-to-day lives, that are often about abstract issues that they're not immediately interfacing with, that they don't know very much about. Sometimes foreign policy issues, sometimes social issues. Foreign policy issues have become culture war issues in the last 5 years or so to a degree that we haven't seen, with flags in people's profiles and people having very strong opinions about parts of the world they don't know very much about. So as all of this has happened, it's become harder and harder to function without the political in more and more areas of life. But there's also an increasing difficulty legitimating political decisions. So there's this increasing need for the political. You encounter a need for the political very quickly now, but it's very hard for anyone to take a decision that others would regard as legitimate. No one has any kind of legitimate claim to expertise, and people disagree very much about what constitutes a fair or equitable process. So you have this need to take a decision to get past intractable disagreement, but you have an inability to legitimate decision. And so you get these lockups, and you get social organizations that don't work, families that don't work, institutions that can't act because they neither have the capacity to socially come together and operate by consensus, nor do they have the capacity to move to the political level and take a decision.
Yeah, well said. And so do you see, for the most part, apathy or smaller scale criminal activity being more likely responses to that than the possibility of more successfully mediating mutual awareness about some of these dynamics and the orientation towards living and building with each other in a more constructive way?
So one of the things that has changed is that in the middle of the 20th century, the percentage of people in a rich country like the United States who went to college was around 5%, and it's now close to 40%. And I think one of the things this has done is produced parts of society that have different levels of acculturation to corporate institutional forms. So there's a kind of corporate administrative subjectivity that we acquire by interacting with institutions. And of course, the public school system is the first uniform iteration of this that people typically get. But the more you stay in university and the more you stay in corporate spaces, the more you tend to be acculturated into a very administrative, technocratic way of thinking, which operates on hierarchy. It operates on you do what you're told because the person above you knows more than you do or has a position that's higher than you. So this produces a different way of thinking from the person who goes through the public school system, goes, ick, I don't like this isn't for me, and then tries to avoid being in corporate or administrative spaces, tries very hard to avoid them and finds them very off-putting, and then struggles when forced to function in them, struggles to be able to be okay in those spaces and to conduct themselves and behave in such a way that they're listened to and taken seriously by bureaucrats. This problem is very acute now. In the middle of the 20th century, the 5% who went to college were acutely aware that they were a tiny minority of the population, that they had a role in administering and managing the society, and that this role was always potentially in danger of facing revolt from other people unless they were quite careful to legitimate it, because there were very few of them and very many people who had not been through the institutional training that they'd been through. So they had a great level of awareness of a need to communicate their administrative activity in such a way that broad sections of the population would find it acceptable. As the percentage of people who go through the university system has increased, there's this perception, especially because the university-educated part of the population disproportionately produces the political speech, does most of the talking, writing, makes most of the shows, and does most of the political participating, does most of the donating, does a disproportionately large amount of voting relative to its size as a percentage of the population, especially in things like primary elections. As a consequence of all of that, there's a perception on the part of administrators that they don't necessarily need to explain themselves to people who don't go through that administrative socialization, and that they don't need to legitimate themselves to that audience can be gradually demographically changed because you can get more and more of it to go to university eventually, that it can be potentially dismissed or relegated to some political extreme or conceded to some other political party without making it the case that elections will necessarily be lost by engaging in that strategy. In my first book, I call this a tendency toward McGovernization, referencing George McGovern, who was the Democratic nominee for president in 1972. And ran this very university-educated oriented campaign in the early 70s that did very badly electorally. And as a consequence of how badly it did, this kind of put off and delayed the taking up of the Democratic Party of that more administrative subjectivity. But gradually, there has been this tendency for the Democratic Party in the United States to take up this side of the culture. And for the Republican Party to shift, it used to be a party that had many different demographics in it, and to instead increasingly cater to the part of society that is not interested in administrative and corporate spaces, that tries to be entrepreneurial, start your own business, run your own show, self-employed, caters to that part of the population. So as this has happened, I think that we have a part of the population that tends to get taken in by the media discourse that is a kind of show that's put on by the college-educated part of the population, often in an attempt to get the rest of the population on side, to machine the rest of the population into supporting various different policies or political strategies. There's a part of the population that's receptive to this messaging and gets involved in what Anton Jaeger calls hyperpolitics. So politicizes and every interaction, things that previously were not treated as political spaces, applies national level or global level political problems to friendships, loses friends, loses family members over disputes about religion, or loses them over disputes about foreign policy. And at the same time, there's another section of the population that is really turned off by all of this stuff. But this part of the population is less administrative, has a lower tendency to have gone through all of that socialization. And this part of the population, crucially, does very little of the writing and talking in public discourse. So this part is rendered mostly invisible I call it the American subaltern in my book, because it's a part of the population which has citizenship nominally and is continuously expected to use that citizenship and demanded to participate and scolded for not voting or not being engaged or not following the news. But this part of the population, I think, rightly recognizes that none of this stuff is really ultimately going to be to their benefit and can't come up with a way of engaging which is productive and therefore moves into that enclavist position.
Yeah, I get that. So doubtless you'll have seen more and more talk, and maybe more than talk, depending on what we think, about civil war increase over recent years, particularly from my perspective, paying more attention to some of that talk about the UK. Now, I did also watch a movie, I think that was titled Civil War, which sort of projected forward some possibility about an American civil war. I've heard you speak about such movies or maybe video games, and indeed the memories we have of the wars in the 20th century as potential reason as to why we might not think it's such a good idea to go that way, because of the real, the horror of that sort of violence. But I don't know. I don't know about the dynamics and the functioning of the psyche when it reaches certain thresholds. There's all these events throughout history where such mass brutal activity, of course, one can give a case for the reasons and maybe the cycles of vengeance and grievance which were previous to it, as to why there might be some new event which we suddenly come to think, well, how could this have happened? And yet, nevertheless, there's still the capacity for human beings, seemingly as well, particularly in the context of collective activity, to drop into modes of violence that shock everyone, including themselves, whether through capacity to dissociate, whether through capacity to find themselves somehow living in a more real way. I have suddenly broken through into some primal expression that feels a whole lot more connected to something significant, at least for that short duration, than they might have been feeling otherwise. And so there's just a major unknown to me there about the particular instrument that is the human being in relation with other human beings. So I'd like to bring that into the space. There's also something which is present with me at the moment as I'm rereading a little bit of Girard's work in Violence and the Sacred. One of the things he says is that the judiciary systems that characterize our context today, and I think he released that book in, mid-late 20th century, maybe 70s or 80s or something like that. So there's been some time that's passed, but that nevertheless, the judiciary system constitutes a very critical development from what he speaks about as the regulation of the energy toward vengeance through sacrificing, whether the innocent, particularly what he names as primitive societies, which there's definitely room to call into question that to some degree, but one of the core distinctions he makes about the victim, whether animal or human, is that should it be sacrificed, it is not going to inspire more vengeance, right? That's the critical reason why it's not just the vengeance taken against who some group considers the guilty party. So there's a stop of this incessant vengeance, eye for an eye, vengeance cycle. And in the context of the judiciary system, we have here a monopoly on violence. He sees justice as actually being a sort of secondary function, but that the primary function being in punishing now, in principle, the guilty, because of that monopoly of violence, is taken to be a stop to that cycle of repetitive vengeance. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because part of the question there for me in really contending to the way that Girard is seeing things is something closer to the affective resting level of how grievance, violence, profound ruptures in the libidinal relations between human beings come to be mediated when there is an absence of legitimation or trust in an overarching or shared context of authority to mediate what would otherwise be a conflagratory, accelerating dynamic. And if it's the case that there is, and Girard, will make the case about, the sacrificial crisis as that time where the scapegoating mechanism in that way, the sacrifice of the innocent, is not sufficient to quell and resolve some of this anxiety and this cycle of vengeance. And so in the context of a legitimation crisis writ large, I wonder about the ways that the more primal means of attempting to soothe or regulate energy and grievance will play out. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that allows a revolution or a coup or something like that to kick off is that there's a legitimation crisis, but there's still a level of unity among those who reject the state, who reject the governing polity. They're able to come together and agree on what they want instead, and they're able to coordinate their activity in service of that thing that they've agreed upon. If you get no revolutionary moment, then there's a possibility that the disagreement that first attacked the state's legitimacy will also attack the legitimacy or the authority of all those who attempt to replace it with something else. So people who try to coordinate together opposition for the purposes of really directly challenging this thing, not only do they struggle to articulate an alternative that's sufficiently compelling, but the disagreement has been allowed over time to penetrate more areas of life, and so as to make it harder not just for the state to govern and take decisions, but also for people to come together in other kinds of organizations and groups and act. So this makes it such that the resentment is less likely to produce coordinated and therefore effective opposition. That doesn't mean that it won't produce opposition, but when the opposition occurs, it's likely to be people who are not in contact with large numbers of other people, people who are atomized, people who don't necessarily have a positive plan, people who are often therefore in a position of some level of suicidality. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of people who have kind of, rather than say, I'm not able to affect the political change I want to see, so I'll get out of politics, become unable to be okay with existence itself on the basis of this, and then either commit suicide through the various lifestyle forms in which you can do that, not just immediate, but also things that you can do over a long period of time, but then also commit acts of terroristic violence in some cases. The difficulty is that these acts don't inspire large movements. Indeed, oftentimes people can express sympathy for these acts, and then the expression of sympathy becomes another delay from doing anything. Because if someone else is doing the act and you express sympathy with the act, then the act has been taken care of by somebody else. It doesn't necessarily have to be done by you. If someone else is inspiring everybody with an act, then you don't have to do it. So oftentimes these people play a role of, for one, disciplining those who don't agree with the act and don't agree with the motivations, because these people get the memo of you have to protect the regime from stuff like this. And then for two, creating among the sympathizers almost an excuse to do even less. And I think, therefore, the tendency is instead among larger sections of people toward that enclavism. The enclavism involves a lot of mediation because of the role corporations are coming to play as people find it more difficult to form families and they become more estranged from faith and from traditional religion. More people are looking for meaning in spaces that are more controlled by corporations. So this would involve the fandoms, which the entertainment companies control, and all of the disputes, cultural disputes that go on in our wider culture come into these fandoms and become bases for people who love, say, Star Wars, to nonetheless become incredibly angry with each other over differences of opinion about casting in a film or the plot of a new movie. Incredibly intense, nasty, angry encounters that are because, in these cases, so much of the person's goals, vision for life that might otherwise have had a political, religious, or familial character has been poured into this fandom and this community of people who have a shared objective desire. The same is also true for tech companies. These tech companies generate followings, particular billionaire, oligarch, genius founder leaders get enormous amounts of attention because people look to these figures to provide some other way that social conditions might be transformed, which doesn't require politics and which only requires their investment or for them to be willing to work for one of these companies and to struggle on its behalf. So the possibility of technology continuing to develop, even though politics and society are frozen in place, causes a lot of deference to any company which is associated with technological change or any particular person who becomes credibly associated with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one could transport that argument to support a techno-feudalist thesis as well by that influence onto critical mediums. Critical mediums here of whether, simply connecting with each other for the purpose of business, or if you don't pay this rate, then you won't get to participate on Amazon or what have you. But also this point about fandom is massive, because if this is where people are investing some of their thumotic energy toward victory and achievement and collective success, and yet these are subtly or not so subtly mediated by technology companies. Yeah, it's very, very profound. So there was a question that you asked rhetorically near the end of a podcast that you did with Cadell last at Philosophy Portal, which I wrote down because it was a particular moment in which you expressed in a very animated way. Now, there's some additional context here, but the question was, are we not capable of trusting ourselves to act politically? Now, the context surrounding that is important. And you're already speaking to some of the reasons you might call on. But there it is. The way you asked that question was, it felt to me like a challenge, actually a challenge to people to consider how they might more imaginatively participate, if not in politics, then in the context we'll speak about in Voicecraft, in the cultivation of relationship, right? In communication at different levels, all manner of things, and participation in understanding. But what do you mean there? What is it that you feel impassioned by? What is the passion you feel when you are asking that question? Are we not capable of trusting ourselves to act politically?
It's difficult because on the one hand, I do understand looking at existing political institutions and the way they operate and what tends to happen when you interact with them. I understand perfectly well why people would consider it rational not to be involved with such things. And generally, I find that decision more reasonable than the various accounts people give of their involvement. Most of the time, I find myself telling people that the ways in which they're trying to be political won't be successful. But this is often because, on some level, what they're calling politics doesn't strike me as really properly politics. A lot of what people call politics today isn't really ultimately to do with taking decisions that matter on matters on which there's intractable disagreement and then legitimating those decisions to somebody else. A lot of the time when people talk about politics, they're talking about the expressing of opinions on issues that are being covered by media personalities on TV or on the internet. At trying to convince people you know interpersonally to think the same way that you do about the news. Posting on social media to try to persuade people. What I sometimes call discourse sorcery. You're trying to be a word sorcerer who uses words to cast spells on people and to get them to change the way they think, change their behavior. Moral injunctions, demanding of people that they behave better without creating the conditions under which that's possible. When you have a condition under which people aren't able to think, they're being continuously messed with by all of this stuff. They're under a lot of pressure. It's very difficult for them to move through their day. And you go around and you demand that they behave the way that you want them to behave, and you scold them for behaving badly. This doesn't actually produce the circumstances that facilitate great human behavior. It's a kind of morality that's become estranged and alienated from politics. Because if you want to act on the basis of morality, you have to find a way to translate that into some form of meaningful activity that changes the world around you. And when you're in a circumstance where persuasive action to do ad hoc social persuasion isn't working, where you have intractable disagreement for all of the reasons we've been talking about, to do with the ways in which the world has changed and the lack of change that has occurred while the world has been changing. There's been all this economic and social change, but no political change to keep up with it. All this integration of the global economy, but no political change to keep up with it. When all of that is going on, the stuff that people want from each other is very unrealistic. And so if you want people around you to be able to do more and be more, you would have to find a way to make an intervention to change their situation. And it might be an intervention that you wouldn't be able to persuade them to endorse beforehand. And this willingness to act without a consensus on the basis of conviction and belief that even though you haven't been able to persuade somebody, it's important and necessary to do the thing in question. This is missing.
Mm.
And then, of course, not just to take the act, but also to legitimate it to the people who don't agree, who say, you're being a tyrant, you're being unfair, I don't like this, to explain to them why you did it, without trying to convince them to agree with the act itself, without insisting that they agree with the act. Allow them to disagree with the act and nonetheless make the case for why you've done it. This kind of conviction and responsibility, which Max Weber talks about as the kind of two traits that the political actor has to have in politics as a vocation, both are completely missing. There's an unwillingness to take decisions and be responsible for them, and there's an unwillingness to adopt the kinds of convictions that would motivate decisions in the first place. There's a lack of seriousness about our convictions. There's a kind of ironic detachment and unwillingness, a kind of pragmatist instrumentalization of our beliefs that doesn't involve taking them fully seriously as things for which we might put ourselves at risk. You know, the abstract values that you have are just your values and somebody else has their values. These are not grounds of a form of life to people. They're not taken seriously in that way. So they can't inspire the kind of action to create conditions under which these forms of life are possible. If you value having a particular kind of family, having a relationship to faith, being in a particular kind of community, you need a kind of society which makes those relationships possible, which facilitates and guards those relationships. And if you don't construct through political action a form of society compatible with the kinds of relationships you wish to have and the forms of life you wish to have, then the conditions for those things will not be generated and they won't ultimately be possible. People are looking to have a highly cooperative mode of engaging with the people around them, but they've not taken the political decisions that are necessary to construct the conditions that allow that level of cooperation and dialogue and constructive dialogue to take place. They're looking for the discussion to happen before the conditions for it have been produced.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so I want to see if I can bring in a few things here to address a little bit of what you've said. We're going to have to go around a few orbits and then return. So one of my earliest relationships with what I perceived as politics was a sense I had that the voice shared there was in some ways words like perverted are coming to mind, words like instrumentalizing, parasitic, ideological in the sense of closed to participate with the question, closed to relate dialectically from another perspective, self-serving and detached from the kind of authenticity and accountability that really participating in understanding requires. Wasn't a place for thinking, for philosophy. There may be somewhere along the way, earlier in the process, good intention, which gave itself over in the end with a bit of a whimper to a kind of compromise that was a compromise too far. These were some initial impressions, which isn't to say there is no quality endeavor to the process. And I have met people who have at some point in their lives engaged in politics, who I also respect as people. But these were my impressions. You mentioned the institutional, bureaucratic sensibility that I don't think is too far away from some of the way that communication and relationship with others can be self-serving and, again, ideologically confined. And so for some time, I've been thinking about such contexts really as institutional authorities, where the game of what it is to participate in them has some important commonalities. It does seem to be the case that the higher up one were to get in some of these institutions is going to be closer to interacting with the more overtly covert and manipulative, like intelligence agencies, and the more dark arts of propaganda and back channel influencing and manipulation that is conspiratorial, in the sense of a few people are deciding it would be worthwhile to influence this particular person to some end or another. And so from this perspective, there's there can be potentially more benign and far less benign bureaucracies and institutions to climb. There are some of these games, politics being one, and certainly big tech and power and money and attention further up those hierarchies, those games, you're going to encounter more and more of the overtly covert and manipulative. But it has and continues to seem to me that the ways in which we as people relate with each other, and the way in which we not only speak but act in integrity to participate in speech, to participate in understanding, to engage in the kind of projects of building in the world and endeavors in life, without which we cannot actually cultivate the qualities, virtues, strengths from actually meeting failure and challenge, and in that sense testing and being met in the process of our ideas meeting the world, well, then we're not building strength, and maybe all we are left with is ideology, and maybe all we are left with is figuring out how to play the game as benignly or not as we might desire to. Part of what I'm wanting to circle in on is some of the energy, some of the basis in desire, or to speak to a conversation I had with Cadell recently, some of the drive, the will, the strength of character and integrity of voice, which can actually inspire trust in the process of rational mediation, but which in and of itself is not explained totally or totally dependent on certainly propositional rationality, or perhaps even the bringing to a close with complete clarity the strength of argument, and us all sharing precisely the same map in terms of how we might bring that to rational discourse and conceptualize it. In that sense, is there a tune? Is there a rhythm? Is there a resonance to the way in which we are participating in understanding, the way in which we are making maps together and challenging others, which is worthy of trust? Is there process? Are there contexts for communication? What kinds of qualities can we cultivate in ourselves? And what ways of encountering others and navigating conversation can inspire and invite and strengthen, through the mutual process of relating, that integrity of channel, which becomes that which we mutually invest our trust in. The second person feel that relationship between the subject as first person, and then maybe the system or structure as third person, which then can become formally codified in maps, however inadequate they are. And so a big part of the project has been relating with, for instance, notions of cultural shamanism and the navigation of different kinds of criticalities of experience in general. Can look at shamanism at a cultural level or maybe a political level, and then also, of course, at a level of consciousness and transformation and healing and all these sorts of things, and relation with nature. And so there's a lot that can be packed in there. But I think about this in general as how we can support the conditions for meeting in that second person field, in relationship, in conversation, in process. Certainly the process and the verb and that philosophical perspective is very critical here. And what I notice is just how challenging it is to cultivate and build those semi-permeable and changing, in a sense, contingent. It's necessary we build them, but in and of themselves, they're also sort of contingent on the quality and integrity that we bring to them. Although maybe it depends if you want to drop some levels and think about the commons more fundamentally as that which is always inherently nourishing and holds the potential for resourcing the way in which life participates with life and death, of course, but nevertheless transformation. But putting that to the side and just coming back to the more human social level of creating, if we can call them structures, that's the part I'm struggling to language here because of there's a certain quality of ephemerality to them. And yet we can also know them reliably as rhythms, ideally. Nevertheless, I notice the way in which the authority of the institution, as well as the inner authority we seek to cultivate as subjects, can, in their own very important ways, work to support or destabilize this space or field of potentiality for meeting and cultivating and strengthening trust in the being with difference and the cultivation of understanding in relation to in what you are naming here as the political, as in intractable disagreements. I mentioned before we started recording that intractable disagreements is something I would, over time, love to really slow down on. There's a sense, from a certain ridiculous perspective, I could imagine the liver and the kidney having some very intractable disagreements about how to function. And yet, of course, when considered from the perspective of how they function in a broader whole and in a process of whole making, they are not, of course, in intractable disagreement and are in profound synergy or something like this. And so the ways in which we cultivate intimacy with each other and a depth of perception about who we are, how we function, what our roles might be, and what kind of structural possibilities we are, or potentials we are shaping together, what kind of holes in their making can we belong to? Well, the devil, so to speak, is very much in the details of disagreements really are intractable or not. I'm not saying for a moment that I'm putting such a notion off the table, and certainly in the context of time and energy constraint and the reality of scarcity, and various levels of shared intention to actually participate in such process of wanting to mediate and resolve. Try having a chat with the Mongols. It's like, okay, yeah, this is not something to be taken off the table in terms of how we relate to that politically. So I've said a lot there. I could continue to seek to land this a little bit more, but this is really just sharing a little bit of some of where I'm coming from, both theoretically, but also at the level of praxis, in terms of, I haven't mentioned the kinds of events to be run or the sessions to be held. I am definitely locating in here as a potential angle for conversation, although I'll leave it open, the particular ways that we as individuals, as subjects, as well as institutions, consciously or less consciously negate in an effacing way or seek to disenable the capacity for cultivating the kind of trust that might lead to or enable genuine political action in the ways that we're describing here. So I'm curious, for more of that. We've spoken a little bit to how the only thing I'll drop in, and thank you for listening, the only thing I'll drop in is just, I've also come into contact with the insidious way that reputational damage and lying, or if not lying, willful indulgence of projection about someone else and cobbling together and projecting more of an image of that for some consciously or less or maybe unconscious reason of self-interest or otherwise. Plenty of room for charity in and amongst all of this, and yet nevertheless there's plenty of sociopathic manipulation in this world. I am seeing the ways in which institutions have their own immune system for interacting with, let's say, some more personally sourced modes of authority and or thumos or desire, right? And so I'm curious your perspective on the ways there that both the third person institutional or states or tech environments, companies, people are in the way of our cultivation of trust, as well as how we as people can get in our own way as well in relation. So a lot there, but curious what thoughts might come forward for you.
Yeah. So I think to build up political capabilities, not just to take decisions, not just to legitimate decisions, but also to sometimes accept decisions on the basis of their being legitimated to by somebody else, we would need to develop people who have certain capacities that are not very common right now. And that would involve, the term I often like to use for it is theurgic structures, to kind of reference the Iamblichus and the Neoplatonists, kind of forms of life, combinations of habits that generate in people over time the qualities that are necessary to embark upon modes of communication, modes of activity and behavior and thinking that are not only not regularly generated in the kind of society that we have, but are often actively thwarted in people who might otherwise develop them. Now, one of the things that I think is very challenging about this is that, as recently as 50, 60, 70 years ago, you could talk about someone having charisma or authority in reference to the whole population. There was a style or a way of presenting yourself which suggested to many people in your society that this person has seen something or has some kind of wisdom. The way to demonstrate wisdom to the public in such a way that the public is inspired to follow you has been itself subjected to this process of disagreement, this pervasion of more and more areas of life of intractable disagreement. And it's captured, I think, in some of the language around base and cringe. Based and cringe. What is based, what is cringe is incredibly variable depending on where you are. And so how someone behaves that might seem to suggest that they have wisdom, that there's somebody that you potentially should follow, to somebody else is cringe. To somebody else is not just not persuasive, but actively disgusting. And this has made it very difficult to try to do something at a mass level. At the same time, because of the way the internet is changing, there's this pressure on internet content creators to message to a mass, but a mass that is not going to be able to come with them in something like theurgic cultivation or an attempt to be meaningfully political. And so there's a continuous mismatch of the economic incentives of content creators, the large audience they need to reach and mobilize, and what it would actually mean to politically and spiritually educate an audience such that it would gain in capability over time. This has me often thinking a lot about monasteries in late antiquity that were founded before or in the early stages of the Christianization of the Roman Empire. So they didn't have institutional support in the way that they eventually came to. And they tended to be home to dropouts, to people who didn't believe that participating in the imperial system would ultimately be a good way to live, that anything would be accomplished by doing that. But also people who retained an interest in doing God work, so in contributing to the making better of the world. These monasteries were often in cities. They were not necessarily anti-political or zones of retreat, but they were a kind of alternative sort of space that was constructed through which different modes of engaging with the social structures of late antiquity could be gradually nourished, cultivated, established, and then distributed. The difficulty, of course, is that any such structure requires some amount of resources, and it's got to get those resources from an existing system, which it has positioned itself in antagonism with. So the young Romans who said, I don't want a job in the imperial service, nonetheless had to get money to support their monastic activities, often from people who were in imperial service or who were large landowners in the Roman Empire. And this produced a relationship of dependence, which to various degrees qualified what they were able to do. Now, many of them prudently and carefully attempted to manage that dynamic so as to retain the maximal level of autonomy to be able to think and cultivate different ways of thinking. But oftentimes this would involve making concessions that could lead you ultimately somewhere far away from where you originally intended to end up. So we have the image of the monastery as the zone of retreat, but we also have the image of the monastery as the corrupt, fallen kind of place that has become entirely embedded in precisely the structures that it has positioned itself as attempting to get outside of. And so this is where I think thinking through the sources of support for intellectual activity and how these sources of support might be managed or combined today to produce a genuine freedom to think and capacity to go where looking at the world takes you. A lot of the time, if you start thinking about the world a little bit too much, you start to go in a direction which causes you to lose support from whoever it was that was backing you. And if you are afraid of that because you don't have any other sources of support cultivated, if you have a relationship of dependence that's too tight, then it becomes difficult to continue to stick with it over an extended period of time. I talk about this in terms of the 4 Ps: parents, partner, patrons, professional institutions. And most people who attempt to engage in intellectual work or try to do really serious building up of people rely too much on one of those 4 things and then have a vulnerability point that then makes it very difficult for them to sustain the work over time and then causes the work to become compromised, but in a way that they often will deny, not just to others, but also to themselves. So you talked about how politicians get into this compromise situation. There's a sort of incentive structure that does that. There's a reliance on the party. The party demands certain forms of behavior. There aren't alternative sources of support on which they might draw in the event that they lose the backing of the party. There seem to be only 2 machines, the Democratic machine and the Republican machine, and no real ability to draw on any other kind of resources. So an intense relationship of dependence develops. And the organizations externally that think of themselves as influencing these candidates often discover they don't actually have the resources to sustain that influence over time. They haven't established the kind of concrete material tie that might give them a real seat at the table, and they instead rely on the character of the politician. They will make claims about the politician being morally upstanding and therefore going to stick with what they said regardless of their ability to offer material support going forward. And that's just not realistic ultimately. So, of course, this doesn't just apply to politicians or to party systems. It applies to any area in social life where we try to construct a structure, which is then supposed to give rise to higher kinds of subjectivity, higher kinds of consciousness, of thinking, of dialogue and discussion. And the very, very difficult challenge is that right now, the ways to make money to support intellectual life so sharply conflict with constructing anything that's generative that even the idea of trying to do intellectual life, I think, strikes many young people as preposterous or fanciful. It seems as if to do that is to become embedded in some kind of bad relationship that will necessarily eat at you over time. But there's still many people who try to become influencers and who are not worried about this at the level of lifestyle influencing, who haven't thought about it in a political or spiritual kind of way and just trying to make their way on the internet. A lot of people think that they can differentiate themselves by having different ideas or using different language. But ultimately, insofar as we can differentiate, it's because we can develop a different kind of structural support base for the conversation that allows the conversation to be different and to sustain being different across time. And this is something that I think people have been very reluctant to take forward at the level of action, in part because to do it would require accepting that you're not going to persuade the whole public. You're not going to succeed by speaking to the entire internet. What you have to do is build up something that is with people that you're able to talk to at this stage. And that's not going to be everybody. Certainly not in the way that you need to be talking to be able to have real growth and real progress. This requires some humility on the part of people, and it also requires an ability to make a decision and to call a halt to a kind of endless quest for everyone to ultimately come around and agree. Politicians often have this problem where they think the next election, more people like me might win. This is something you can think forever as a politician, especially if you're in the House of Representatives. Every 2 years, there's another election. The next one, more people like me might win. And this way of thinking that eventually the discourse will come around if you do the right kind of discourse sorcery and you get enough friends together who do the same word magic that you do at the same time, this way of thinking traps people in a kind of endless quest for a level of support that isn't obtainable, certainly not in a way that's compatible with their project or goal, or at least the one that they started with.
Yeah, very well said. And for those of you listening to this who might be just listening for the first or second time, it is fair, I think, to think about voicecraft as well as some of these other contexts I've named, like Cadell's Philosophy Portal and also OG's work. But speaking on behalf of voicecraft, it's fair to see voicecraft as a project that has been engaging very much in the tension of the address that you're inviting us to consider there, Benjamin. It has been a journey. And the only thing I'll say, well, I'll probably say quite a lot actually in response, but one of the things I'll say is that the energy that one can source from oneself, or the way in the conversation with Cadell using the language of drive, there's a certain drive and sacrifice, which, of course, like any life, is not infinite, but is also a factor in supporting the time in active, open, discerning, engaged relation to building those other kinds of support bases, catching other forms of waves. There's a lot actually that would be fun to speak about in another conversation here at the level of the structural experiments over time that I've run and the different kinds of challenges faced along the way. In a sense, yeah, I often don't use the language of the political to frame some of those, staying much closer usually just to the the psychology and I suppose more of a kind of intimacy of relationality that can strengthen or weaken in relation to solidifying and building those structures of support. But of course, there is a political dimension to it. Absolutely. So, yeah, and it's a difficult thing for me to break down immediately all the different ways, because the image I'm getting is very much like a mycelial structure or root structure that's like stretching out in many ways at once and is encountering nutrients or obstacles or challenges, right? Or rivalries, for those resources along the way. And so I definitely support that breadth of process. But then that itself can sometimes look a little unstructured, and itself can look a little bit like the kind of thing that makes it difficult to know, well, what are you really trying to do here exactly? If you're wanting to continue to cultivate the kind of environment where use the language of the intellectual, but where real participation and understanding is possible, and where that is made possible in critical part through the cultivation of relationships that are participating in that process, real relationships, then there's so much nuance. There's so much nuance to actually relate to everyone's unique situation there, and so much subtlety in stretching and bending more to give here and maybe being unable to do so over there. And then, also, I suppose one of the things which is the language, for me would be closer to the language of the political as I would usually understand it, but which has not been as present in the way I've approached things. Although I've been engaging with this question, I have been challenging myself, and to some degree, I'm not being absolute about this. There's some kind of continuum here. But political alliances, where there might be a tremendous amount of disagreement and maybe dislike, but in making that alliance, they can advance some common goal, and then it all breaks down in the end, or it doesn't, or whatever anyway. That's par for the course in politics. That's a little bit different in the contexts where one might approach friendship, although not so in the context of cultivating relation with a team you play sport with, where not everybody doesn't need to necessarily get on and make friends, but can they collaborate in this critical way? And so there is something about alliance building as a question that I think is interesting to bring back in the political a bit here. And there have at least been ways in which I've conceived of and have endeavored to build the context of voicecraft and advance some ideas in relation as to the kind of quality or sensibility, accountability, and integrity between private and public expression that is seeking to call into responsibility the critical qualities of what it takes to strengthen the channel or field of understanding in a transformative way itself, rather than to project a voice or attempt to dominate in a way that would be, that you might classify as falling away from the ideal of the kind of intellectual engagement and cultivation of trust with each other sufficient to build a more viable political way. noting that the way in which, by and large, attention in the context of the culture war is by being a warrior for one side or another, switching sides or another, but in all cases really not so much caring for the shared field of understanding, but playing to the crowd, whatever that happens to be. And so I think there have been some ways in which I've been conceiving how to strengthen and defend, let's say, the channel from that kind of activity. And yet, I consistently wonder about what kinds of structures that could support the kind of growth where growth is necessary to achieve a certain kind of financial support or resource flow that can welcome and navigate the kinds of dynamics and approaches to interaction which can be allied with, although in and of themselves would not be sufficient to actually have gotten the project to where it is now, let's say, or to do some of the more preliminary or pre-positioning or deeper work of gathering and tending to the fire and the warmth and many other things too, and the mystery, really, tending to the mystery, I think that is necessary. So I do see a certain, different stages, and there's a certain mystery around when to engage in different kinds of experiment, and not being too hasty about that, being very patient, I think is important. But what I do believe is that it's only really possible to see or think about what this kind of growth or alliance or cultivation of strength takes or looks like in the active process of dedication over years and years and years, and looking at these different, if not levels, then important moments in the eventful becoming of the context. You don't just get to jump in without doing the groundwork, but also, is your groundwork sufficient to actually start to engage in some of the aspects that, if done poorly, can be so corrosive to politics. So yeah, the meaning of alliances, this is a tricky one.
Yeah, some of this, a couple of different things I thought about. One is the problem of making the esoteric exoteric.
Absolutely.
So when you try to scale up something that involves a high level of spiritual rigor, there's an attempt to take something which is usually accessible only to people who have spent a lot of time and dedicated themselves to something. There's an attempt to make that accessible to a larger number of people quickly. Because if it's not made accessible to a large enough number of people quickly enough, then there is a risk that they will lose interest or defect or not offer the support that they might otherwise offer. This eso-exo problem recurs continuously throughout human history, as people often rush the making exoteric of the esoteric, often because of material need for a larger support base quickly. And it tends to produce traditions that have large parts of them that are debased, that have fallen away from the thing. And yet it's very difficult to avoid this problem, because if you have an excessive level of patience with regard to this, not only do you tend to not grow enough to sustain yourself, but often you find that you're competing with other organizations that are similar to you, but more willing to try to reach for the exo immediately. and that those organizations tend to take your lunch. Thinking here about the conflict between Augustine and the Donatists, for instance. The Donatists wanted a kind of Christianity that was much more demanding and much harder for most people to be able to do. And Augustine said, you're not going to be able to pull this off. It's not going to be able to work at the level of the Roman Empire. And therefore, in attempting to do this, not only will you fail to do it, but ultimately something that reaches out more readily is going to outcompete you and you're going to disappear, which is what ultimately happened to the Donatists. Of course, the response from the Donatists, who are not around to give it, would be that in reaching for the entirety of Roman society at that stage, damage was necessarily done to the teaching, which of course it was. This kind of trade-off is hard to avoid. One of the ways in which this SOXO problem manifests very frequently now is something I call the chronic recognition lack problem. There's a lot of people today who come from family institutions that have been dysfunctional because the people who are operating their family were under a lot of pressure on account of how the society has become structured. So you have an increasingly large number of families, both parents having to work to be able to bring in enough money, which means no parent around often enough at home, more fighting about money, which causes families to come apart, and then fighting between the parents over the child. These kinds of things, parents who are too busy, parents who fight with each other, or parents who get divorced and then fight with each other, have produced very large numbers of people who didn't get exposed to the appropriate kind of love at an early enough point in life to reach a certain level of spiritual adjustment that ordinarily an 18-year-old who comes from a functioning family would be able to achieve. These people then become 25, 35, 45 years old or older without really being able to progress, because when they enter into this kind of situation, they think that they're looking for spiritual growth, but they're looking for something that they should have gotten when they were children but were denied. The difficulty is that oftentimes institutions which try to do real serious theurgic one-to-one close relationship forms of education attract this kind of person precisely because they offer a seeming closeness to a person who is charismatic, potentially authoritative. And so there is an overwhelming tendency for this kind of person to be attracted to that kind of organization. And yet, if a person becomes surrounded by people who suffer from chronic recognition lack, they won't actually be able to do what they're aiming to do at all. The people around them will want affirmation from them rather than the challenges that can result in their growth and development. And this produces one of the couple of different versions of what I call the gaggle of fuckers problem. The gaggle of fuckers problem is where you have a very charismatic person who's seen something, has some real wisdom, has an insight, and then they attract around themselves, instead of people who are interested in working on that together with them, people who want to use the charismatic person to satisfy something more base. So it can either be to fill in for the recognition that was not received in family life, or oftentimes in the academy, it's a group of people who want to publish in conversation with a very brilliant person's work so that they can rack up a large number of publications quickly so as to obtain tenure. So you'll get in many departments, many universities, I've seen this happen, academics, one of whom is really very sharp, and a set of people around who take the academics' ideas and translate them into something that's more attractive to external funding organizations, and then use this to publish repeatedly. So the academic becomes the engine of creativity, and then what they do is they become conduits between this academic and credible, sustainable sources of funding. And in this way, the academic's genius is made compatible with the maintenance of university departments. Two problems that are very similar, but occur in almost completely different kinds of spaces. One very institutional, one to do with professional institutions and how they work, and the other much more common with people in society who are dealing with large numbers of autodidacts who have come to them through the internet. But both have the same effect, which is to surround the person with bad conversation, prevent them from themselves growing or even being able to maintain the same level of development that they were at previously, and then unable to transmit it to anybody, because all of the attempts at transmission run into one of these people who is instead looking to use it to do something else.
Yeah, very well said. I see those dynamics very much. And I mean, the esoteric exoteric one is being very much discussed publicly over the years on Voicecraft. The more social parasitism one, the gaggle of fuckers one. There you go. Yeah, brilliant name. Yeah, I mean, that can, as you say, be disenabling in a number of ways. Yeah.
The sad thing is when the charismatic person becomes economically dependent on the gaggle. And so even though the charismatic person knows the gaggle is a gaggle, they can't get rid of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely the kicker. That's definitely the kicker. And it's so difficult. It's so difficult to navigate when addressing the potentials or subtleties for these types of things, when the actual relationship and the actual subtleties might not fit so neatly into the formal description, that actually to be in relation with the person isn't necessarily just to think about them as one of a gaggle of fuckers, that to mediate that situation otherwise is going to involve remaining in, well, in some instances, it'd be critical to remain in a deeper kind of address. Now, there are time, energy, difficulties with that, for sure. And then, as you say, there might also be, let's say, various attachment or otherwise developmental factors which influence things in kind of bar the very participation in the relationship that would be the way through, at least if you were to stay in a sort of like an adaptive formation. Please go ahead.
It's horrible because it's not at all their fault. It's a consequence of our living in a society in which high forms of consciousness are very irregularly generated, very difficult to generate. And so the tendency is not for these people to come together and to form a dialogue with each other, but to get caught in different communities of people who are lost and looking for help. And so, of course, there is this obligation to help. What's the point of being someone who can see something or has wisdom if you can't help people? So there is this felt obligation, duty to help, but also there's a death by 1,000 cuts problem of taking on too many of these tasks at once, especially without a community of people who are operating in a similar level of consciousness with whom you can dialogue about the cases.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so the trajectory of my life, at risk of sounding like I'm just putting myself in what would be seen as an aspirational category here, but the journey of my life has involved one where I left England at quite a young age, and I've mostly always been capable of just about stepping into, actually, if I wanted to, capable of playing the game of what it takes to step inside of institutional context. The thing was, I never wanted to. From a very young age, I felt a profound aversion very, very affectively. So as a result, I've sort of been walking between different contexts, different groups of people, but also cultivating, intimate relationships with many people in those different contexts. And through university, I also was quite quick to recognize that there weren't pathways there for me in the mode of relationship that I considered to be critical for real generative philosophy, certainly for real dialogue. And so without earlier on being able to name these dynamics, I had a pretty good intuitive sense of where the vitality was, at least that I could participate in. I do think there's vitality for people to participate in within the institutions, but you've got to be real careful for some of the reasons that you're mentioning, for sure. So, yeah, but all of this to say that over these years, actually, I have encountered and met many people who are, in fact, quite capable of supporting processes of relating with this type of challenge. And yet, of course, there are still tremendous challenges, massive challenges for how to actually, on an ongoing way, help to coordinate and enrich materially, as well as less materially, let's say, the livelihoods and opportunities of the many people involved. And so, but I guess I'm just remarking on this because I am fortunate enough, and I've also been dedicated toward this end of really deepening with people who help to enrich the possibility for welcoming others into that deepening. That might be the best way to put it, you know. And I've also recognized there is a dynamic, but also a real difference in proximality to some kinds of esoteric understanding, or if not understanding, at the very least, regulation of energy in relation to the opening to understanding and opening to potential and predicament. That makes a big difference for how much one can seek to build a field that can, again, welcome progressively more people into participating and enriching the depth and breadth of it. And so the esoteric and the exoteric being a big factor there. It's partly why if I look over the course of the years, it's towards the end of the podcast where I'll start to engage in a mode of expression which can be very difficult for people to follow. But if I didn't do it, in a sense, there would be something about our meeting and potential for sharing and understanding that I would feel to be slightly lacking. Although I could instrumentally, and you're such an excellent speaker and passionate speaker that it's more than clear it's possible to structure an interview in a way that I think your speech can actually reach lots of people. And I think already is. I'd be quite surprised. Well, it depends actually, because it might be the case that your message is deemed a little bit too radical, but I don't think so. I would be surprised if it wasn't within the next 12 to 24 months that some much larger channels were wanting to welcome in some of your perspectives into their conversation. I know you've already spoken to many great channels, but I'm thinking of, ones where all of a sudden you start to get into the hundreds of thousands or more views. I could see it. And because you're speaking to some of the impasses and tensions people are experiencing. You are doing it in an accessible way, and politics. And I see that you're bringing in and integrating the spiritual challenges for people in a way that isn't just lip service, but a lot of your expression is capable of being received at a level where quite a lot of public discourse is. So it'll be curious to see how that develops over the years to come. And so I certainly wish you well in that process. And I'd love to invite you to further conversations. Often we run, group conversations, might have 3 or 4 people or more in dialogue. And I really appreciate the way you build bridges to connect the state of political awareness and discourse with a spirit of wrestling with the predicament of living and transformation. And so to engage in political discourse without being memed up and chewed up into a position in the culture war must be something of sort of interest to you, I suppose. And yeah, I do think that there are quite a lot of places now, and a growing network of people with, people who participate in those fields, whether just through listening or more directly, that can begin to form the kind of bridges from those who might gain more attention through their speech in some contexts, but who then remain in participation with, let's say, a little bit more generative conversation. And I'll just leave it at that. And I think, I got to stay in the game. Got to stay in the game. And who knows, all the different things influencing the game. There's a lot of things influencing the game. But I feel some of that potential for the future. So it's been a pleasure to speak with you. I'm just wondering if you'd like to share any closing thoughts.
It's very kind of you, Tim. And of course, I would be happy to talk again in future. Sometimes I think about what I do as being like a vulture that watches something very unpleasant from a great height, looking to see if there might be at some stage something to do about this that might do some good from my point of view, but trying to keep a certain level of distance from it so as not to be caught up in it, and trying not to preemptively intervene in it so as not to get knocked about by it. And trying to construct perches so that it can be viewed from different places without having to worry about the flying so much. Because if you're focusing too much on trying to stay in the sky, then you aren't going to be looking very well or very hard. And if you're feeling bothered while you're up there in the air, you can get very much distracted from what it is that you're trying to observe and learn about. And I think there's a kind of ambition in that, but also a humility. The humility being to not immediately identify with the thing on the ground, to think that you are it or that you can immediately transform it, but also an aspiration to genuinely continue to look at the thing and to stay in dialogue with it, even as I try to maintain that kind of distance. When I talked to Cadell, I drew this in comparison with Hegel's Owl of Minerva and Marx's Gallic Cock. The Owl of Minerva tells you about what happened in the past, and the Gallic Cock announces that now is the time to do whatever it is. But the vulture knows that it's going to be a while before there's an opportunity to do something, and yet something must be done. And so the task is, can we keep looking long enough? And can we learn while we look? Or are we going to get caught up in other things?
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, there's lots to say there. The act of looking itself is what really is looking if one is looking from a detached place. But then also there's the subtlety and even so William James had famously 4 marks of the mystical. I don't know if I'll remember them all right now, but one of them, the one that always felt to me hardest to grok, was passivity. And that comes to mind here a little bit. There's a philosopher named Forrest Landry who's been on the channel many times, a very remarkable thinker. And he connotes the question type of when to belong to mysticism. And there's something about the passivity and maybe the stillness and the patience of looking and attending that I'm connecting together here in relation. Nevertheless, we are involved, and I don't think ever entirely inert. But isn't that in the waiting? There is such a subtlety. There's been times in my life where, in very, very critical moments, whether I choose this way or that, whether I speak this thing or that thing in a context of profound intimacy, and the waiting for the right kind of impulse, movement to give voice comes forth. As I reflect on my life, there's something so unique about those moments, and very precious and very, very mysterious. So maybe a lovely place to bring this to a close, and thank you very much.
Thank you.